Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 3 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, have been allowing the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. After which, we'll talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings. I'll share with you guys my thought process and opinions while presenting statistics that justify these players' current rankings as we enter week 3. A reminder for those of you guys who are wondering, all statistics, everything that I present is for a half PPR scoring format over the course of today's episode, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Additionally, if you guys are looking for specific players, there are timestamps down in the description of the video so you can check those out. While you're down there, if you have yet to do so, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Help us reach our goal of 80,000 subscribers. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So whether it is waiver wire videos, weekly rankings, live streams, Sunday morning live streams, trade targets, all of that for the singular purpose of trying to help you guys out. Now, for those of you who want an even bigger advantage outside of the videos here, you can be sure to travel down to the description and check out the link traveling over to Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew to sign up and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, but you're also going to get my rankings sent to you from me, specifically every single Sunday morning from weeks 13 through 18. Those rankings include by position quarterback, running back, tight end, wide receiver, kicker, defense, all of that, on top of flex rankings, half PPR and full PPR. So regardless of what you're doing this upcoming season on Sunday mornings, you'll have my rankings available so that you can set yourself up for success for the remainder of the season. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible of taking advantage of the opportunity of helping me help you for the remainder of the season, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen. And of course, draft responsibly, play the Pickens game via Underdog. Thank you very much for the support. All right, so let's talk about wide receiver matchups going into week 3. As you guys can see on screen, we have wide receiver receiving statistics allowed. We go ahead and isolate wide receiver receiving statistics because the cornerbacks and safeties, the coverage that they play doesn't really impact the overall rushing yards that someone like Deebo Samuel is able to accumulate within a given week. Therefore, I isolate receiving statistics. Okay, so as you guys can see, the Los Angeles Chargers, for the second week in a row, of course, are still giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers, primarily because of the efforts of Tyreek Hill in week 1. But as we progress to the remainder of the season, we're going to continue to see these numbers fluctuate as we continue on. Nonetheless, the Indianapolis Colts, the Tennessee Titans, the Seattle Seahawks, Philadelphia Eagles, defenses and specifically secondaries that have struggled against opposing wide receivers thus far this season. On average, the Philadelphia Eagles secondary dealing with a lot of injuries, so are the Seattle Seahawks. The Tennessee Titans, because of how great they are in terms of stopping the run, have become a passing funnel over the course of the last 3 seasons. And of course, we know that the Indianapolis Colts, they are struggling heavily because they no longer have Isaiah Rodgers and someone like Stefon Gilmore in their secondary. 2 of the best cornerbacks in 2022 are no longer on that team, which is making it that much easier to pass the ball against that secondary. Nonetheless, just wanted to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of an indication as to the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. We'll talk about some of the more difficult matchups on the other end of the spectrum in regards to the Dallas Cowboys, the Carolina Panthers, Cleveland Browns, teams that have really been great in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers, but it primarily has to do with the fact that the teams that they have played really haven't had much wide receiver kind of talent, to be totally honest. The Dallas Cowboys in week 1 completely shut out the Giants. In week 2, even though Garrett Wilson was the only wide receiver on that team really doing anything, he was able to score himself a 69-yard receiving touchdown with the ability to make a play after the catch. Nonetheless, the Carolina Panthers, they don't even have their primary number 1 cornerback, J.C. Horn. So there are opportunities here in which these defenses, sure, may not have given up a lot of points thus far already because of the lack of touchdowns that they have allowed in the secondary. But as we progress, we'll also find which cornerbacks we typically want to avoid within a given weekly basis. Jair Alexander, Sauce Gardner, those kind of cornerbacks, Stephon Gilmore, Trayvon Diggs, they'll begin to present themselves, Denzel Ward, and we probably avoid them as we continue on. But either way, just wanted to give you guys this context. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 3. We'll mention these statistics as we progress. But as of right now, let's begin with our number 1, Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson has had 2 great weeks for fantasy purposes, and you guys already know that you're starting him, but the fact of the matter is, he has yet to score a touchdown. Everybody else in that offense has scored a touchdown. Madison, Addison, Hawkinson, everybody's ending with his son. Interestingly enough, Osborne, now that doesn't work that way, but either way, in regards to Justin Jefferson, the Minnesota Vikings as a passing attack, they're number 2 in terms of passing yards in the National Football League thus far, and number 1 in terms of passing touchdowns, tied with the Green Bay Packers. I think it's just a matter of whether or not Justin Jefferson can get over the hump. Besides him scoring 19 fantasy points in terms of receiving yards and receptions in general, he gets a touchdown and he'll be that number one as we continue for the remainder of the season. Moving on to our number 2, Tyreek Hill. Like we presented earlier in regards to the Underdog 100K Sunday play as of this weekend, his current number is at 91.5 receiving yards. If there is a possibility that Jaylen Waddle does end up missing this weekend because he is currently in the concussion protocol of the injury that he sustained late in that game against the New England Patriots on Sunday Night Football, we're going to have to wait and see whether or not he is going to be a participant within that game. Tyreek Hill going up against the Denver Broncos. Patrick Surtain II is going to definitely have his hands full trying to cover him, but nonetheless, if in fact Jaylen Waddle is not available, it's going to be Tyreek Hill and on Tyreek Hill only to be able to carry this team to the promised land, because guys like, Craycraft and Barrios aren't going to be able to get the job done. So if he's by himself, I'm expecting a huge game. And even if Jaylen Waddle's, available, really going up against his secondary, it is on Tyreek Hill to make a statement game here and have himself another big performance. We saw Bill Belichick slow him down, and I'm expecting every other defensive coordinator to try to copy exactly what, Belichick's defense did against Tyreek Hill for the remainder of the season. Moving on to our number 3, we have Stefon Diggs. Finally, we got Josh Allen back on, track. Obviously, week 1's performance was a fluke. Week 2's performance, fantastic. Unfortunately, we saw a flip-flop in terms of the overall contributions and opportunities for Stefon Diggs, primarily because when Josh Allen has an 84% passing completion percentage, over 270 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns, you don't really need to get Stefon Diggs heavily involved when everyone else is finding success against a terrible secondary like the Las Vegas Raiders. They take on the Washington Commanders in this given week. Last week, the Washington Commanders gave up a lot of big plays to wide receivers. Marvin Mims over the top. We also saw some plays from, Brandon Johnson late in that game with a Hail Mary. It doesn't really count, but ultimately, if we're able to see Stefon Diggs make these big plays down the field like we know that he's capable of, 4 of his overall 11 touchdowns in 2022 were of 20 or more yards down the field. If he's able to make these big plays on top of it, he'll just continue to solidify himself as a top-tier wide receiver, as we expect. Our number 4 for this week is CeeDee Lamb. Had himself a little bit of a resurgence in week 1, unfortunately, because of the blowout 40-0. Really wasn't a huge proponent of that offense and wasn't really asked to do much in that overall game. But last week against the New York Jets, despite the coverage and all that was available, going up against Sauce Gardner on some occasions, but again, when he's matched up with Sauce Gardner, wasn't targeted often. That's pretty much the same formula for every single team as they take on the New York Jets. CeeDee Lamb still able to get 13 targets, 11 catches, 143, 19.8 fantasy points. He takes on Marco Wilson as the number 1 primary cornerback of the Arizona Cardinals. Marco Wilson thus far this season has allowed 16 targets, 13 receptions, 213 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown. When he's allowing over 100 yards per game on average in terms of coverage, and the fact that CeeDee Lamb has been able to eclipse 100 receiving yards or more in 5 out of the last 7 games he's played with Dak Prescott, I'm expecting CeeDee Lamb to have himself a big game. Now, to begin the A tier, this is not hyperbole. This is not me overreacting. Puka Nacua deserves to be in this conversation because what he's been able to accomplish thus far this season already, and really doesn't look like he's slowing down. Puka Nacua takes on the Cincinnati Bengals this week, and playing against, Mike Hilton certainly is going to be a conversation as to whether or not, when he lines up in the slot position, that he'll find an excess amount of success like he did in the last couple weeks. But nonetheless, the opportunities that he has been given is second to literally no one. In terms of the wide receiver position, he's number 1 in total targets. He has 10 more targets than Justin Jefferson. Number 1 in the National Football League in total receptions. He has 5 more than Justin Jefferson. He's number 2 in wide receiver receiving yards, ahead of Tyreek Hill, but only 43 yards less than Justin Jefferson. He broke the record set by Earl Cooper in 1980 for having most receptions in the first 2 games of a season. The amount of success that he has found. He's the first player in NFL history to have 10 catches and 100 receiving yards in the first 2 games of their career. Puka Nacua he's unbelievable. Therefore, you have to start him. Moving on, let me go ahead and remind you guys, if you have not yet already checked out the 1.01 brand, the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel's official merchandise line, you can travel down to the description and check out andrewkirchhoffshop.com. Again, we're providing high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays. So if you guys want to continue to support the channel, rep the 1.01 brand, and greetings and salutations, be sure to go ahead, travel on over to the website. If you guys are interested, of course, support the channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about our number 6. Davante Adams. Davante Adams obviously had himself a great week, despite the fact that overall, that offense was pretty much non-effective for the majority of that game. When the running game pretty much disappears and Josh Jacobs finishes with 9 carries and -2 yards, it's not really a surprise that everything begins to fall apart. Jimmy Garoppolo turns over the ball multiple occasions, but Davante Adams still had himself a great week. This is 2 consecutive games in which he's had 8 or more targets, 6 or more receptions, obviously getting himself a touchdown this time around because of the absence of Jacoby Myers could end up playing a factor, but going into this upcoming week, taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers, he will probably be primarily matching up with Patrick Peterson. Patrick Peterson in the last 2 games against Davante Adams, this was back when Davante Adams in 2021 was with the Green Bay Packers against the Minnesota Vikings. Patrick Peterson was there in those 2 games, 7 catches, 115 and 2 touchdowns, and the other 11 catches, 136 and a touchdown. He's dominated against Patrick Peterson in his career. I'm expecting a lot of success here, especially when the running game begins to find success. Play action is only going to help open it up for Davante Adams in this offense. Number 7 is Amon-Ra St. Brown. So there was a report on Sunday that Amon-Ra St. Brown left the game and was dealing with cramping issues. He only played 74% of the overall snaps and still had himself 102 receiving yards on 6 catches. But later do we now know that he was dealing with a turf toe injury that could end up sidelining him for multiple weeks if in fact it is a higher grade injury. Now, I'm not a doctor, but in terms of what we saw from Terry McLaurin, it held him out for a couple weeks there, but eventually was able to return for week 1. If in fact it's a lower grade overall injury, we can hopefully see Amon-Ra St. Brown kind of return this week, but I don't know at what capacity. Hopefully he'll be able to play. The matchup this week against the Atlanta Falcons, it's one of the most advantageous, especially when you're going up against a guy like D. Alford, their primary nickel corner. When Amon-Ra St. Brown is in the slot position, he's dominating. Hopefully he's available to find success for us this week. Moving on to Ja'Marr Chase on number 8. I know Ja'Marr Chase has had a very slow start, but like I've told many of you, you want to go ahead and you want to trade for players that start slowly because eventually they're going to get back to their success because they're elite level talent. Ja'Marr Chase is one of the most talented wide receivers in the National Football League. There's a reason why he was the 2nd overall pick of many of our drafts. We know what he's capable of. It's just a matter of Joe Burrow getting back to his healthy state. And Joe Burrow obviously was dealing with that calf injury in the preseason. It has obviously followed him and tailed him into the regular season and certainly slowed down this offense as a whole. Nonetheless, we have seen spurts of this offense in which we find success. T. Higgins primarily last week with 2 receiving touchdowns. It's just a matter of time until Ja'Marr Chase has himself his breakout week. You make sure you go ahead and trade for him now before he ends up having himself a monster game against the LA Rams secondary in the given week. All right, let's move on to the B tier of this conversation. Another one of these players that has been struggling. Obviously, he's had himself a couple tantrums on the sideline thus far this season. A.J. Brown in week 1 had himself an ample amount of targets. But going into week 2 against the Minnesota Vikings on a short week, there wasn't really an emphasis on passing the ball much. In fact, in that game, the Philadelphia Eagles only had 23 total passing attempts and ran the ball, running back rushing attempts, wide receiver rushing attempts, and quarterback rushing attempts 48 times, 23 to 48. Obviously, you can imagine why A.J. Brown was very much so frustrated. But just like Nick Sirianni said, going from week 1 to week 2, week 1's performance against the New England Patriots, we saw very little utilization of Dallas Goedert and, of course, DeAndre Swift. Because of this, he made it an emphasis, hey, we're going to get them the ball more. And exactly that's what they did. The first pass of the game on Thursday night against the Minnesota Vikings went towards Dallas Goedert. And, of course, 28 rushing attempts went towards DeAndre Swift and his overall efforts. So we're going to see A.J. Brown have himself a big week. Just get him on roster. Try to trade for him if you possibly can. He's going to get more touches. And once, in fact, he does, he's going to dominate. He's taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary. Carlton Davis missed last week. If he's going to miss again, it's only going to help in the given matchup for a guy like A.J. Brown. Now, on the opposite side of the field, of course, A.J. Brown has an opportunity of playing with the Slim Reaper, a.k.a. DeVonta Smith, who has had himself 2 fantastic performances for fantasy purposes in the last 2 weeks. Now, primarily, the reason why DeVonta Smith has been so potent for fantasy as of late is those receiving touchdowns that he's been able to accumulate. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is, when you take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, they are such a great run-stopping defense ultimately, and even though the Philadelphia Eagles offensive line is elite, it is definitely going to be a struggle overall. Nonetheless, they're so good in terms of stopping the run. At times, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary has become a passing funnel because teams really cannot find success in terms of running the ball against them on a consistent basis. Therefore, going into the given week, when you have A.J. Brown pulling double coverage nearly every play, DeVonta Smith is going to continue to find success just like he did last season and as he'll continue for the remainder of this season. Moving on to our number 11. On the other side of the matchup, when we're talking about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they take on the Philadelphia Eagles secondary, and Mike Evans has himself another opportunity on hand to put up a great week. Mike Evans is, in my opinion, the biggest surprise of the 2023 season by far and away. Baker Mayfield playing at the level that he is. Again, like we mentioned this offseason, there was a potential with Dave Canales going over to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the former quarterbacks coach of Geno Smith with the Seattle Seahawks last year. There was a potential, like we mentioned, that Baker Mayfield makes that Geno Smith jump. And we're beginning to progress into that direction. And guys like Mike Evans are just really benefiting from that ultimately. Mike Evans in the last 2 games has scored 41.7 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. He's the number 2 overall wide receiver in the format. Just to put this in perspective, last season from weeks 9 through 16, he only scored 48 points. And again, like I've mentioned in the last 2 weeks, nearly 42 fantasy points. Mike Evans has been nuclear as of late. He takes on the Philadelphia Eagles, who had a privilege of taking them on in the playoffs just a couple years back against Darius Slay. 9 catches, 117 and a touchdown, 22.2 fantasy points. As of this current moment in time, within this offense, it is a little bit different, but he's still getting himself a 26.5% target share. And the Eagles secondary, whether it is Avonte Maddox, Bradbury, Blankenship, Nakobe Dean, obviously their primary coverage linebacker, they're all injured. There may be a chance here for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to definitely do some damage against that, shorthanded secondary. Moving on to Keenan Allen. Man, Keenan Allen has been special. He is really putting the overall age discussion to rest every time he goes out there and performs well. Coming off a 27-point week, was the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football on a half PPR because of the 2 receiving touchdowns that he scored. Just to put this in perspective, in the last 11 healthy games that Keenan Allen has played this season, going into last season's playoffs and whenever he was healthy as he returned from his injury, in the last 11 healthy games, 10.5 targets, 7.3 receptions, 84 receiving yards, 0.55 receiving touchdowns, and 15.25 fantasy points per game. Unbelievable numbers. And to even go further beyond, if there's a potential in which Austin Eckler does not play in the given week because he already didn't practice earlier today, in games since 2020 with Justin Herbert at quarterback, in which Austin Eckler has missed and not been in the lineup, we have seen Keenan Allen average 10 targets, 7.6 receptions, 82 receiving yards, 0.88 receiving touchdowns, and 16.99 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting him to have another big week here against the Minnesota Vikings secondary that has struggled mightily this season already. Have himself another big week here, Keenan Allen. Moving on. We have Deebo Samuel as our number 13. He will be playing on a short week on Thursday night against the New York Giants defense. The New York Giants defense, they have struggled. The Arizona Cardinals had their way with them, and so did the Dallas Cowboys. So why not the San Francisco 49ers, perhaps the hottest team in the National Football League at this current moment in time? Deebo Samuel's coming off a major performance, as he always does against the Los Angeles Rams, put up 19 fantasy points. I don't know how that overall touchdown that he scored was considered a rushing touchdown. It was a screen, and it was just on the line of scrimmage. So I don't think it was like a lateral to constitute it being a rushing attempt. Nonetheless, when he's finding the end zone, Deebo Samuel's fantastic. One of the primary reasons he had such a big game, besides the fact that he always likes to ball out against the LA Rams, was the fact that Brandon Aiyuk was dealing with a little bit of an injury, a shoulder injury. Some would consider it perhaps a stinger. We're going to have to wait and see what his likelihood of playing is by the time we get to Thursday. But either way, with Brandon Aiyuk dealing with an injury, it opens up more opportunities for targets in the direction of Deebo Samuel. He had a couple opportunities down the field that very easily could have been receiving touchdowns of 40 or more yards. It's just a matter of Brock Purdy being a little bit more accurate with those overall attempts and having himself success. Going up against the New York Giants, who just got torched by the Arizona Cardinals, like I mentioned earlier, I'm expecting Deebo Samuel to find himself a lot of success in the given week. Number 14 is Calvin Ridley. Now, the reason why Calvin Ridley is a little bit lower ranked isn't because of his overall performance against the Kansas City Chiefs. I could really care less about that. The offense as a whole was just shut down completely. When you go up against the Houston Texans, typically the Houston Texans are a running funnel. You want to run the ball against them consistently because you are going to mount a lead. And then with the effort of Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, they're going to be able to run the ball consistently and find success. The issue with that is if, in fact, Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram aren't able to immediately find success against this defense and they mount an early lead, Calvin Ridley may not be able to get himself as much potential of scoring a touchdown further on within that game. You got to remember last season in the 2 matchups in which we did see Trevor Lawrence take on this defense, he threw for 0 touchdowns in both matchups. So I am a little bit concerned about that. Nonetheless, we have seen wide receivers find success against this defense. Primarily, Michael Pittman Jr., 8 catches for 56 last week in week 1. Zay Flowers, 9 catches for 78. We're hoping for more upside from Calvin Ridley. Hopefully, he can score a touchdown early on so we don't have to worry about him. Moving on to our number 15, Chris Olave. Chris Olave, amongst all wide receivers thus far this season, has the 5th most overall targets, 21 total. He is clearly, by far and away, the favorite target of Derek Carr. Even though overall those targets aren't the most accurate, ultimately, they're going to continue to build that rapport, and Chris Olave is going to continue to maintain his relevancy for fantasy purposes. They do take on the Green Bay Packers. I'm expecting Michael Thomas to pull a lot of that coverage from Jair Alexander, but then again, there are so many weapons within this offense with Olave, Michael Thomas, and Rashid Shaheed. It's going to be difficult for Green Bay secondary as a whole. As of this current moment in time, Chris Olave thus far this season is playing about 42% of his offensive snaps from the slot position, which is allowing him to continue to just cut up the middle of the field, take care of mismatches, and deliver for fantasy purposes. If it wasn't for the fact that he barely stepped out of bounds against the Carolina Panthers, he would have had a touchdown on his scoreline ultimately another fantastic play. Number 16 is DK Metcalf. Now, DK Metcalf left the game early against the Detroit Lions, dealing with a little bit of a rib injury, and we're going to have to keep that monitored as the week progresses, but nonetheless, he did return with that injury and still played through it. His overall contributions weren't the greatest, but 6 catches for 75 while still dealing with an injury is significant. And yes, Tyler Lockett was the guy that had themselves the blow-up week, but that's going to happen. Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, they're going to go back and forth having themselves these successful weeks, but taking on the Carolina Panthers without JC Horn, that opens up so much more opportunity for DK Metcalf as the number 1 wide receiver on the outside to find success. Last season, week 14 against the Carolina Panthers, 10 targets, 5 catches, 71 yards and a touchdown, 15.6 fantasy points. I'm expecting continued success. Hopefully he's healthy and ready to go. Number 17 is T. Higgins. Now, speaking of having a bounce back week, T. Higgins delivered for us in that overall circumstance. 8 catches on 12 targets, 89 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. There was a pass on a skinny post down the middle in which Joe Burrow didn't even respect the other safety, threw a blatant pick. There could have very easily been a 3-touchdown game for T. Higgins if it wasn't for Joe Burrow's overall ball placement and where he delivered it on that overall drive. Nonetheless, T. Higgins, bounce back game was expected, and we're hoping that we're going to just continue to find success. As Jamar Chase on the opposite side of the field pulls primary coverage every single week, it's going to open up more of a distraction for T. Higgins to succeed. That's just, how it works. That's why DeVonta Smith finds so much success. That's why Jaylen Waddle finds so much success, because the number 2 wide receivers of these elite offenses, who quite frankly would be number 1s on other teams, are able to go ahead, work against, number 2 cornerbacks and not have to deal with, double coverage majority of the game and find success. T. Higgins back on track, should be ready to go for another great week here in week 3. Number 18, speaking of Jaylen Waddle, we have our number 18 here. He is currently in the concussion protocol. If, in fact, he is going to play, I would like to have him in on my roster, but it's just a matter of whether or not the concussion protocol allows him to play. Nonetheless, they do take on the Denver Broncos. I wanted to go ahead and mention the stat because typically on Underdog Fantasy, if, in fact, Jaylen Waddle is active and playing, they typically always have a receiving yard number for him available. So typically those numbers are within like 60 to 70 receiving yards, and they never really go further than that unless, Tyreek Hill is going to miss a game. Nonetheless, in terms of statistics, with Tua Tagovailoa, in the last 14 healthy games that Jaylen Waddle has played with Tua, he has been able to surpass 66 or more receiving yards in 12 out of the last 14 games. If you're able to get Tua 5 or 6 receptions, 60 plus receiving yards, and then he's able to accommodate the performance with a receiving touchdown, he will absolutely blow out the number 18 ranking. It's just a matter of, is he healthy and ready to go for Sunday's game? Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Lockett, our number 19. Tyler Lockett, a bounce back game. Like I mentioned in week 1, he had the first 2 receptions of the game. And then with 14 minutes and like 12 seconds left in the first quarter, did not have a single reception for the remainder of the game. And that was obviously a fluke. We witnessed that last week, obviously, with his performance against the Detroit Lions. 8 catches, 59 and 2 touchdowns. Now continues that streak against the Carolina Panthers this upcoming week, as they are obviously dealing with injuries in their secondary. Last season in week 14 against the Carolina Panthers, Tyler Lockett, 5 catches, 60 yards and a touchdown, 14.5 fantasy points. I'm expecting Geno Smith, like he did last week, can continue this streak of success. He's back on track, and this offense is looking fantastic. Being able to dethrone the Detroit Lions the way that they did in Detroit, that is special. They're going to continue to find success here. Number 20 is Amari Cooper. Now, Amari Cooper did not practice earlier today. He is currently designated with a hamstring injury. Again, like we were all expecting, he was injured and kind of placed on the injury report on Saturday of last week going into the Monday game. We were very much so worried about him, yet he still ended up playing 7 receptions and 90 yards. I mean, a fantastic game overall, still dealing with that injury. So he's currently designated with a hamstring/groin injury. If in fact he's able to play, this is one of the best matchups you can possibly ask for, taking on the Tennessee Titans. Like I mentioned earlier, the Titans' run-stop defense is so incredible and elite. It has often become a passing funnel for offenses to only have to be able to throw the ball against the secondary, which honestly does not have enough, high-tier personnel to be able to stop a lot of these elite wide receivers. It's purely going to be a matter of whether or not Deshaun Watson can elevate his game in the absence of Nick Chubb to be able to get this offense to a successful point. But I think obviously Amari Cooper is a good enough wide receiver to help elevate him there. He's just got to be healthy for the task on hand. Moving on to our number 21, we have Mike Williams. Mike Williams, 8 catches on 13 targets, 83 receiving yards. That is the level of opportunity we need to continue to see from him. And the primary reason that we saw that number wasn't only just because of the fact that they were taking on the Tennessee Titans, and of course it is difficult to run the ball on him, but primarily because Austin Eckler's absent. When Austin Eckler is absent, there is 4 more target upside for a lot of these receiving options available. Therefore, Mike Williams going forward, if in fact we're going to see Austin Eckler miss another consecutive week here, he takes on the Minnesota Vikings, a defense that has given up a fair share of points, not only to Mike Evans in week 1, but of course DeVonta Smith in week 2, both of them being able to work on the deep ball and find themselves success in those overall manners. I'm expecting Mike Williams as the deep ball receiver of this team to be able to elevate his game in the matchup because of that higher volume of targets going in his direction. Number 22 is Nico Collins. I can't ignore the fact that Nico Collins is playing extremely well. CJ Stroud, 91 passing attempts in the last 2 games, number 3 amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League, 626 passing yards, number 4 amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League. These numbers I cannot ignore. Taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, sure, it is a little bit of a more difficult matchup, but ultimately CJ Stroud has been without an offensive line, 4 of their 5 starters out, and has still been able to, with a lot of pressure in his face, deliver the ball down the field and get guys like Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Robert Woods, Bobby Trees relevant. Now, in the last 2 weeks, Nico Collins has accumulated 20 total targets. That is only 22% of the overall target share of this offense. And nonetheless, on top of that, he played less snaps than both Tank Dell and Robert Woods in week 2, yet he's the most efficient of all these wide receivers. Again, Nico Collins is getting the job done. He's a consistent option. He deserves to start once again within the given week. Moving on to George Pickens at number 23. George Pickens, in the absence of Deontay Johnson, is going to be asked to step up. Deontay Johnson, obviously being placed on the injured reserve, makes it where this offense is only going to find success in the passing game with George Pickens. Pratt Freiermuth, Calvin Austin, Allen Robinson, there were no-shows on Monday night. So it is purely up to George Pickens to step up. He had 10 targets, only 4 catches, but with one of those receptions was able to take it to the house to be able to accumulate 127 total yards and a receiving touchdown. Matt Canada's offense is very much so confusing. I don't understand why they have built it the way they have. It is very old school, and it really needs to go ahead and upgrade itself sooner rather than later. Otherwise, Kenny Pickett is going to struggle, and so will George Pickens. But when George Pickens is given enough opportunity throughout his entire career, in which he's been able to get 4 or more receptions in a game, he is averaging 78 receiving yards, 0.57 receiving touchdowns, and 13.84 fantasy points per game. He's only been able to accomplish that in 7 games in his career, but when given opportunity, George Pickens will deliver. Taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, I'm expecting him to find a lot of success. Moving on to our number 24, Chris Godwin. Even though I rank Chris Godwin highly every single week, he may not be delivering for fantasy purposes at the level at which I want him to, but ultimately, he's getting the opportunities that he needs. It's just a matter of him, finding that ever elusive touchdown or making an additional play. He's pretty much getting himself 5 catches, 50, 60 yards. It's just a matter of now that he has an opportunity of going up against the Philadelphia Eagles with no Avonte Maddox, their primary nickel corner, obviously had surgery this week, torn pec. They are still dealing with injuries in their secondary with their safety Blankenship. Bradbury's dealing with an injury. Nakobe Dean is dealing with an injury as a linebacker. This secondary has gave up a lot of points. Again, they gave up the 5th most points to opposing wide receivers in the first 2 weeks of the season. Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they're going to be able to push them to the limit. And hopefully Godwin can get an even better game than what he's typically producing in terms of a 7 to 8 point performance, get himself a touchdown or even more yardage, and have yourself a big week here. Moving on to our number 25, we have Michael Pittman Jr. Anthony Richardson is currently in the concussion protocol. If Gardner Minshew is going to be replacing him, I trust that Gardner Minshew can absolutely elevate Michael Pittman Jr. You go back to last season, in the 2 games in which Gardner Minshew took over for Jalen Hurts in the regular season, one against the Cowboys, one against the New Orleans Saints. That Cowboys game, we saw a lot of success for DeVonta Smith. And I'm hoping that we can go ahead and give Michael Pittman Jr. a lot of targets, just like he had last week, 12 targets, 8 catches, 56. Against the Baltimore Ravens, if in fact they're going to continue to miss Marlon Humphrey, it'll open up a lot of opportunity regardless of who's playing quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts. On number 26 for this week is Zay Flowers. With Odell Beckham Jr. going down with an injury, there is a potential in which Odell Beckham could end up missing the game this upcoming Sunday, but that doesn't really make an impact on the overall production of Zay Flowers. Thus far this season, in the first 2 weeks, he's led all wide receivers among the Baltimore Ravens group in terms of overall snaps and targets. And as long as he's going to continue to maintain the top workload and volume within this offense, of course, he's going to be the most relevant within the team. They take on the Indianapolis Colts secondary, like I've mentioned on multiple occasions thus far this season already. Without Stephon Gilmore and Isaiah Rodgers within their secondary this season, they are far less productive, and they're giving up a lot of fantasy points. The second most amongst all teams to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average. we're hoping for another big game here from Zay Flowers. Now, I understand that last week, 4 catches, 62 isn't the upside weeks that we want to see from him. But again, going up against the Cincinnati Bengals secondary is not an easy task on hand. Therefore, he struggled a little bit at times. Nonetheless, Zay Flowers has himself a great matchup in the given week against Indianapolis. Our number 27 is Brandon Aiyuk. Like I mentioned earlier in regards to Deebo Samuel, Brandon Aiyuk is dealing with a little bit of a shoulder injury. Obviously, he sustained that on Sunday, but nonetheless was still able to get himself 3 catches for 43 in the matchup against the LA Rams. If it wasn't for Brock Purdy overthrowing a couple passes, Brandon Aiyuk could have had himself another massive game in week 2. It's just going to be a matter of whether or not we're going to end up seeing him playing on Thursday. Again, it is a short week going from a Sunday game dealing with an injury and immediately playing on Thursday. We already know that Saquon Barkley is out. There's a potential in which Brandon Aiyuk could be limited or potentially even outright miss this given game because of that injury, and they're trying to keep him healthy. We're going to have to, keep an eye on that. Nonetheless, if he ends up playing, I have him as my number 27 wide receiver against the New York Giants secondary that, again, is very inexperienced and has not played well this season. Moving on to Drake London, our number 28. Drake London is identical proof, just like Tyler Lockett was, just like T. Higgins was, that you have to wait for some of these wide receivers to find their stride within a given season. And once they do, they are going to be as valuable as we anticipated in the offseason, why we ranked them so highly. Drake London in week 1 was a nobody, 0 points, just like T. Higgins, but in week 2, in a very difficult matchup against the Green Bay Packers, in which we thought there was going to be a lot of Jair Alexander coverage, 6 catches, 67 and a touchdown. It just seems like Drake London always has these big performances against great secondaries. I remember last season at the beginning of the year, he was taking on the LA Rams. I thought to myself, there's no way that him taking on, Jalen Ramsey is going to be successful. He had himself a massive game in that week nonetheless. So either way, with Desmond Ridder, ultimately, Drake London more often than not has been a better wide receiver for fantasy purposes. Therefore, we're going to continue on this train of starting him on a weekly basis. They do take on the Detroit Lions this week. They're going to be missing their starting safety, Gardner Johnson, out for the season. Ultimately, in the games in which we have seen Desmond Ridder play with Drake London, the last 6 games together, Drake London's averaging 7.3 targets, 5.2 receptions, 67 receiving yards, 0.17 receiving touchdowns, and 9.58 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. We're hoping for a big game as a wide receiver 3 option here. Hopefully he finds the end zone, but if he doesn't, the yards will be able to get the job done. Moving on to our number 29, Christian Watson. Now, I'm not 100% certain as to whether or not he's even going to play this week, but what we do know is that he is trending in the right direction. Last Friday, he had a limited participation of practice. Now, earlier today, I don't even know if he practiced. The designation was not put out prior to the recording of this video. I'm hoping that he is going to get to a full participation by Thursday, Friday. And if that's going to be the case, he will be playing against the New Orleans Saints. You got to remember, in week 1, Romeo Doubs, 2 receiving touchdowns. In week 2, Jaden Reed, the rookie wide receiver, 2 receiving touchdowns. Week 3, let's spice it up. Let's hope for a 2 receiving touchdown game for Christian Watson. Probably unlikely, as he'll be taking on Marshawn Lattimore, but nonetheless, Jordan Love leading the National Football League, tied with Kirk Cousins in total passing touchdowns. This is an offense that you want your receiving pieces associated with. Therefore, if Christian Watson's available, he's starting. Moving on to Garrett Wilson, number 30. Even though you have, Zach Wilson under center, and even though we only saw Garrett Wilson hauling 2 overall receptions on the 8 total targets he had throughout that entire game, it only takes one play to be relevant for fantasy purposes. And quite frankly, that's exactly what Garrett Wilson was able to do. Had himself a 69-yard reception. It was a reception he made 13 yards away from the line of scrimmage in the middle of the field on a nice little play action pass. And he was able to make a singular defender miss, and the coverage player that was on his tail was not able to catch him considering his speed. Nonetheless, Garrett Wilson going into this given week against the New England Patriots, it's not the easiest matchup. But if you go back to last season, week 8, Garrett Wilson with Zach Wilson under center had 6 catches on 7 targets, 115 and 14.5 fantasy points against the New England Patriots. They have found success together in this given matchup. We're just hoping that it'll just take one given play and Garrett Wilson can once again be relevant for another consecutive week. Moving on to our number 31, DeAndre Hopkins. He is known for being a tough player. He is known for playing through injuries, and even though he plays through injuries, it often gives us a little bit less, comfortability in starting him because we don't know how injured he truly is if he's just going to play anyway. Therefore, coming off of a week of 4 receptions for 40 yards, it was apparent that he's obviously dealing with an injury. Hopefully, he'll get himself a full week of practice. Nonetheless, he takes on the Cleveland Browns. Denzel Ward in primary coverage is not easy. And when you have, Ryan Tannehill having a better week in week 2, it is definitely going to trend in the right direction. Ultimately, once we get a healthy DeAndre Hopkins at a full capacity, it's just a matter of can we find that in the given matchup in a week in which we're probably going to see both these teams running a bunch within the given game. Moving on, we have a number 32, DJ Moore. I expected DJ Moore to have himself a great upside week 2 because of his comfortability and familiarity against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers organization, obviously having played them twice a year for the last 5 years as a member of the Carolina Panthers. Nonetheless, with 6 catches, 104, he still had himself an underwhelming performance in my mind. And the fact of the matter is, Justin Fields really needs to get back to, playing his old style of football from weeks 5 through 17 of last season, in which he's running on designed runs and he's getting himself more involved in honestly getting this team down the field. Amongst all teams in the National Football League thus far this season, the Chicago Bears are up there in terms of most 3 and out, series as an offense. We're hoping that, of course, DJ Moore can continue to be a relevant part of this offense, but it's purely going to be on the shoulders of the offensive coordinator and Justin Fields getting on the right page. We know that the defensive coordinator of the Chicago Bears resigned earlier today. The Kansas City Chiefs are going to have their way with that defense. It'll turn into a negative game script very quickly. DJ Moore is going to be asked to catch many of passes, and hopefully he's up for the task on hand. Moving on to our number 33, Terry McLaurin. Another one of these wide receivers that are great, unfortunately aren't getting enough targets, and specifically is in a tough matchup against the Buffalo Bills. Even though Terry McLaurin was able to make a huge grab down the field in triple coverage against the Denver Broncos secondary, it is purely just going to be a matter of whether Sam Howell, the Angry Bird as I like to call him, is able to really just continue to pepper Terry McLaurin with targets. We know that Logan Thomas is probably going to miss due to the concussion protocol. Curtis Samuel wasn't as big of an option, and Jahan Dotson really hasn't shown much of any upside within the given season. Therefore, Terry McLaurin is going to be asked to continue to be that relevant receiving option within this offense. In a negative game script, I'm hoping for him to have himself another big game here. Moving on to our number 34, Jordan Addison. We ranked him in week 1. I did not expect him to score an easy touchdown like he did. We didn't rank him in week 2. He did it again on Thursday night against the Philadelphia Eagles. And now we're hoping for a third consecutive week in which this man, the rookie wide receiver, can come out of nowhere and score another touchdown. Now, unfortunately, it really doesn't bode well for him, primarily because of the overall 133 receiving yards that he has under his belt. 2 of those receptions consist of 101 of those 133 receiving yards. That's 76% of his production in terms of yardage on 2 different plays. And obviously, a lot of his overall fantasy production is based on those 2 overall plays. Coming off of a week in which they were in a negative game script and throwing for the entirety of that second half, considering they turned over the ball 4 times, the Minnesota Vikings only targeted Jordan Addison 5 times. That is not enough, in my mind, to constitute continuing to start him. But if he's going to continue to score touchdowns, I can't ignore it. The fact of the matter is, in terms of passing attempts and his overall target share, Jordan Addison only has a 12.5% target share within this offense. It is not an automatic start, but I'll put his name on the list considering how consistent he's been as of late, and I'll just continue to hope that he makes deep plays down the field. Moving on to our number 35, Jerry Jeudy. He takes on the Miami Dolphins secondary. We saw Marvin Mims, Brandon Johnson, even Cortland Sutton be relevant in terms of fantasy purposes last week with Russell Wilson. I really want to contribute Jerry Jeudy's lack of overall production to the fact that, quite frankly, that was his first preseason game. And now that he's kind of found his footing, he'll probably end up finding himself far more success in the given matchup. He played 71.4% of his overall snaps from the slot position. We have seen slot wide receivers already thus far this season find a lot of success, specifically Keenan Allen in week 1 against the Miami Dolphins. If Jerry Jeudy is going to be given the opportunity to take on that mismatch, he should have himself a solid week here. The final player I wanted to mention before we close out today's episode is Christian Kirk. Like I mentioned with guys like T. Higgins, Tyler Lockett, Drake London, Christian Kirk is another one of these players that we ranked highly in the offseason that, yes, may not have had a great week 1, but ultimately had a bounce back in week 2, 11 catches, 14 total targets, 110 receiving yards. Incredible numbers because every time he plays up against the Kansas City Chiefs, he plays well. But unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, when he takes on the Houston Texans, which is the matchup going into week 3, he does not play well. In fact, the offense does not throw the ball much, and they don't find much success in the matchup. The reason why I have him ranked here primarily is because Zay Jones is likely going to miss due to the knee injury. And if, in fact, Zay Jones is going to miss and, Calvin Ridley is going to pull primary coverage from Steven Nelson, Christian Kirk will be asked to continue to do more within this offense. Again, the volume of 14 targets is no joke, and I'm hoping that he'll continue to see a higher volume of targets as we progress for the remainder of the season. Now, there could have been a lot of other wide receivers I could have named on today's episode. Players like Michael Thomas, Adam Thielen, Rashid Shaheed, Devontae Parker's, Marquise Hollywood Browns, Josh Reynolds, if in fact, a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown ends up missing, Tank Dell, Robert Woods, Sky Moore, Tutu Atwell, players that have played well as of late, just couldn't make the cut. Nonetheless, Hope you guys appreciate the content. If you guys do, click the like button down below. Of course, be sure to subscribe. Try to get us closer to 80,000 subscribers. Greatly appreciate you guys supporting the channel. Tomorrow, I'll be back with quarterback and tight end rankings in the exact same video prior to the Thursday night matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and New York Giants. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, have a good night, and I'll see you guys. Peace.